Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you tonight, and I thank everyone that's come for taking the time out of a Tuesday evening. My purpose is to try and present with pretty broad brushstrokes some background information, and as Larissa said, that may involve repetition, it can happen, just to give general information about some of the concerns that I think do apply to tunnels and how they operate and the exhaust emissions within them and the way they're discharged. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't build tunnels, and it doesn't necessarily mean you can't build these projects. But one of the points I want to come to is that you need to take all these things carefully into account up front. A, to make sure what you're building is safe, and B, to make sure if there's a cost implication in safety that it's taken into account, so that when you finally actually get to a business case or something you can get your hands on to analyse why this is a good thing to do, you're sure that all the costs are taken into account. And I might come back to that later. I'll start with Larissa's diagram and her assumption, which is a reasonable one because it's based on the chief scientist at the time of the state's view that emission stacks can have a 1,200 metre radius effect, and it can be difficult to model. But if you take the diagram that Larissa just had and you apply those 1,200 metre radii to it, you can see that the area that you live in is potentially subject to impact. Now, if all is done well, that doesn't imply that that impact is bad, but it's a vulnerability. It's a potential for impact, and as you'll hear later in the evening, a little from me and more from others, the risk of impact from polluted air is very significant to health. And my colleague Dr. Ray Nasser, who can't be here tonight, but has done an enormous amount of work in a very objective way on this topic, and it seems to me compelling and beyond any reasonable doubt that if you allow an environment to develop where air quality is prejudiced, you are therefore moving into an environment where health risks are increased and everything that goes with it, cost, misery and so on. So air quality is a really important issue. Once again, I don't come to the position that that stops you having developments within a city, but I think it influences and informs very much how you should go about undertaking those things. That's a bit redundant because we just had a very excellent run through on that diagram from Larissa. The tunnelling sites that were proposed in the July document gave two options, and I think option B seems to be the one that's favoured at the moment. I'm not 100% certain, but both of them involve large sites either side of the road here. The option A was around the Flat Rock baseball diamond, and option B, I think, a more elongated area here. But rather than worry too much about the exact location, one of the things that is important to note in that, I think, is that those sites involve quite a degree of impact. They involve a lot of extra vehicles, they involve a lot of dust, and you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, in the interview later with Wendy Bacon. There's a degree of pain in implementing a project of this magnitude, and a lot of that pain is felt around work sites by the nature of extra traffic, by the nature of additional dust pollutants, by virtue of noise, by virtue of loss of amenity, by virtue of loss of access to a facility that might be important to you. Now, it seems to me, if you have an overwhelmingly good project, then no pain, no gain applies. It's a bit ironic in this case that the people that take the pain probably don't get the gain. But if the project's okay, there's probably no major project that can be absolutely painlessly introduced. But what I wanted to try and develop, and I'm sure others will follow with, is the importance of making sure you have got a good project. Because if you don't, then you're taking the pain for no gain. These shots just simply show a larger version. If you take a rough 1,200 metre radius from the proposed stack, the rough location of the proposed stack at Artarmon, it clearly comes very close to this area we're talking about, and that simply reflects what Larissa said earlier. Likewise, from the stacks in this area, we reach up. So you're pretty well subject to impact. So now I should speak very briefly, because others will follow, about the two levels of impacts and risks that I think should be of concern. One is those immediate term construction impacts. The pain that if it's a good project you just have to take in order to get there. You're going to have increased vehicle movements, you've got dust, you've got noise, you've got loss of amenity. My own view, but it is simply my view, and I am the first to concede that if you live close to that work site you might hold quite a different view. But the one to really have in mind in the long term, after you get through that pain, what are we doing? What are the impacts when you operate a tunnel in particular in the long term? You've built it, all the agony's over, the dust has settled, the noise is gone, the trucks are gone, you've lost some of the places that were probably very important to you, but you might argue, well, that's progress, that's the cost of doing things. But then the ongoing operation is a 24/7 situation. And what I wanted to focus on in the time I've got is the question of the air quality inside the tunnels, the question of stack emissions, which remains important because they've got a very important local impact, and offset that in fairness by saying, as the proponents of the project would do, but you're removing traffic from the surface. You're solving one problem, and this is a good net equation. The classic defence is, well, you take a lot of slow-moving vehicles with relatively high exhaust emissions, put them in a tunnel, they run very smoothly, and you get rid of all the emissions at one point. Don't talk too quickly about the people around that, because the stack will make sure the dispersion is okay, and I'll come back to that, it might not. But there is a point that if you can improve traffic amenity in a constructive way, there's a net improvement. I think Michelle might well have some thoughts later, and I don't preempt in any way what her thoughts may be, but there is a risk in these things that you're kicking the can down the road a little bit, that you're not really long-term solving anything. But you live in a big city, you do have to pay reasonable attention to roads and facilities to get around. Somehow I think, and I'll leave the balance of the story to Michelle, who's expert in the field, you need to balance that with some long-term strategy that is sustainable, that works, that isn't just another lane, another tunnel, another road, because there is an argument, and I think there's some wisdom in it, that's just inducing a bigger problem somewhere down the track. But I'll leave that to Michelle. Tunnel air quality issues, internal and external, and the pollutants of concern. Carbon monoxide used to be a big problem, not so much now, but nitrogen dioxide, hydrocarbon residues, and fine particulates, particularly fine particulates, which is a choice of words, are things of concern. And these little particulates have a double whammy in that they have the capacity, because of their very small size, to enter the respiratory system and bypass the normal bodily protection and filters in the nose and so on. And some of these rather potentially dangerous hydrocarbon residues that float around in the exhaust stream can adsorb onto the surface, so these act as a vector to take often quite carcinogenic materials into your system. So it's a serious issue, and that's one of the reasons people like Dr. Ray Nasser are so concerned about the potential for high levels of pollution, even moderately elevated levels of pollution. So I guess the guts of that is, what can you do about it? Because if we come to this from a position of saying, well, I want to make an informed decision about this tunnel, you can look at how you ventilate the tunnel, how you push the air around in the tunnel, and then when you come to get rid of it, is there some mileage in order with the ability, if you're going to build a tunnel, to treat the air? Does it work? Are there options? And I think there's quite a bit of misinformation around, and I'll hopefully come to that, and others may well come to it also. First of all, in terms of ventilation, there's a process called longitudinal ventilation, which is the one that's proposed for all of these tunnels, and for the West Connects and the North Connects. And it's a cheap and efficient system, and it works quite well for short tunnels with not too many vehicles. And it's like a big pipe, and everything goes in one end. You go in your vehicle, the air goes in, there's some fans to help push it along. But the main device to push the air and increasingly polluted air along is you and your vehicle. It's a piston. So it's a bit like swimming in the sewer pipe. It's intimate, it's friendly, you're in there with the pollutants, and eventually you get to the other end and you come out. The risk with it, in my opinion, is that it stops working in busy, heavily trafficked tunnels when they get to be about 4 kilometres long. Because the drag effects, and you like water in a pipe, like any fluid in a pipe, the drag effects increase as you go along, almost exponentially. So when you get to the end, and I don't want to use a lot of numbers, but I will use a little example, because we do have some figures for the North Connects tunnel, and there's a bit of a shortage of figures for this project at this early stage, but it seems not too early to make a decision to go ahead with it, but a bit too early to actually do any analysis. But that's one system. In my view, that system's a risky system with heavily trafficked tunnels over 4 or 5 kilometres long. The other system, which is more expensive, is to dig the tunnel in such a way that you've got a shaft for fresh air, a shaft for contaminated air, and you continuously wash air across the traffic as you go along. And it's a more expensive process because you've got to drive a bigger tunnel, you've got to run these shafts, you've got to run the air, you've still got to get rid of the polluted air at the end, so that doesn't change that. It's a process called transverse ventilation, and if you wanted to draw a crude analogy and you thought about a coal miner, this is a coal miner having a bath, he's just in there swimming around with the gear. This is the one where he's having a shower and the pollutants are being washed off. So it's more expensive. I'll come to it in a minute, but it's recently a major tunnel's been completed under Tokyo, a ring road tunnel, I think in total about 22 kilometres of tunnel, and they have chosen there to go to the expense of using that system. It's of concern to me that there's a bit of information around that that system isn't used. This is the only system that's used in the world, and it's actually not quite right. It's the cheapest way, and if you can get away with it and it works, cheap is good, but it doesn't always work that way. There's another system called semi-transverse where you feed the fresh air in progressively and wash the whole thing along, about a halfway house between the two. Just quickly on that, our existing tunnels, or some of them, the harbour tunnel, only 1.3 kilometres long, was set up for transverse ventilation. I don't think it's being used, and I think it's being longitudinally push ventilated with the emissions coming out of the stack in the northern pylon of the Harbour Bridge. The eastern distributor, the M5 East, the Lane Cove Tunnel and the Cross City Tunnel, all longitudinally ventilated, all relatively short in length, although the longest of them, the M5 East, has had major air quality problems. The response to that has been, but we've got the design right now. And that, look, that may well be right. But it's interesting, it's long and it's busy, and there have been air quality problems. It's interesting also that there was provision in the design for the fitting of air treatment to the Lane Cove Tunnel and the Cross City Tunnel. And in the M5 East there was a very dubious trial of filtration equipment that I'll come to in a moment. Air treatment does work. There's two fundamental methods. One is electrostatic precipitation, where you feed the polluted air into a situation where you've got a lot of ionising electrodes, you put a charge on the particles, and you have oppositely charged collection plates that take the particles out. It works, it's widely used in the world, it's about 80% efficient. It's generally used in conjunction with a system of activated carbon and catalysts. So the air comes out of this sort of process, runs through some activated carbon filter beds that are fitted with precious metal catalysts that help remove 90% of nitrogen dioxide, 90% of hydrocarbon residues and have the effect of picking up any stray particles. So you get something like an 80-90% pollution reduction in the air going through. And that's equipment that's being used in that major tunnel in Japan. As a matter of interest, in a major tunnel in Madrid, and I'm the first to admit that they went absolutely berserk with their expense on the thing, but they decided to recover some existing roadways, turn them into park areas for the public, and they were able to discharge air from the tunnel at the surface simply by virtue of treatment. In other words, rather than have stack emissions, they put the stack underground, treated the air, and discharged it as quite safe air to breathe right there at the surface. So there's some problems. Tunnel ventilation is a problem and exhaust emissions are a problem, and I said I would have one little example. One tunnel we do have some detail on, which is nearing completion, is the North Connects tunnel. And at the time the EAS came out, and it's always good to use government data rather than your own, the then Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Kerry Chant, who's a good person, expressed concern that pollution levels at the end of those tunnels, particularly the south-north one, but it's very similar results both ways, because of the factors I mentioned, were greatly exceeding the allowable particulate levels. Now, here come the numbers, but I'll keep it reasonable. PM10s, which are the particulates that also includes the smaller PM2.5s, the safe level in the atmosphere is deemed to be 30 micrograms per cubic metre. Forget the units and just think of 30. So 30 is okay. Ray Nasser would argue 30 is not okay, a lower number, but take 30 as currently the number, the air quality goal of the state government and the Australian government. Kerry Chant's concern was that the levels looked like much higher than that. And she said, look, if levels are, she said, there's a lot of fat built into these rules and regulations, but if you get to 300, if kids suffer from asthma, they're triggered straight away. So she's saying, look, if you apply a multiple of 10, you've got a problem. And I think that makes sense. I think most of these standards are set with quite a lot of fat, if you like. And when she looked at the EIS, the government's own estimate of PM10 levels at the end of the, technical assistance there. At the end of the it was 500 units, 500 micrograms per cubic metre, which is 500 versus 30. And she had a further concern. She said, but that's based on free-flowing traffic. If anyone's had much to do with Pennant Hills Road, free-flowing is not a word that you associate with Pennant Hills Road. And the tunnel won't be free-flowing all the time. So you need to take account of congested traffic. And I did some work on that, and you very quickly got to 1,000 units. Very quickly, and it got higher. Because it starts to exponentiate towards the end, everything's going the wrong way. So you've got a situation where the Chief Medical Officer has said, look, I'm nervous about this. She was nervous about 500, I'm nervous about 1,000. And the response was, and I used the parallel when I spoke to a media a few weeks ago, the former and much lamented Premier of Queensland, JBLP Peterson, had a habit of saying to people, don't you worry about that. And that's the answer Kerry got from the Transurban. Don't you worry about that, it won't be a problem. We'll fix that. And that to me lacks a little bit of rigour. I mean, it is a problem. Now, if you can ventilate the tunnel properly and keep the air safe, it comes back to the old rule of mining engineers. Look, leave the economics to the accountants. If I'm going to build this thing, number one, I can't have it collapse, and number two, I've got to be able to breathe the air. They're two golden rules of tunnels and holes and all those things. Now, I'm not convinced that the ventilation method's right for a busy, long tunnel, and I think much more rigour is needed. Exhaust emissions are harmful, and that little example I gave you, which is an example based on figures from the North Connects EIS, and there's just no comparable data available for this tunnel at this stage or for this proposed road system, is of concern. Both might be solvable, but both are of concern, I think. There are health impacts, and exhaust emissions are harmful to health, and risks increase with concentration. And here we've got a guideline of 30, and you very quickly find yourself dealing with 1,000. And therefore, whatever risk applies at the guideline level, and Ray Nassar would say there is a risk at 30, it's a significantly greater risk at 1,000 or higher. And I've mentioned concerns from government agencies, so it's not, I come to this sort of a bit agnostic, but it's not just concerns I might hold. People within the system have, honest people within the system, have concerns. People like Ray Nassar have got concerns, and Ray is a very reputable and responsible guy, a really decent fellow. Now, he might be erring on the side of super precautionary, I'm not sure. But he has a concern, and he's a person of great credit. And it, to me, comes down to this bottom point that in all of this, you look at the documentation and you go quickly through it, and it's fluff. It's not substantial. It's a PR exercise. And I think that's a little bit contemptuous of the public. I think you need and deserve something a lot better, because the funding for this came from flogging off the electricity assets, and that hasn't gone all that well. You know, the cost of electricity hasn't exactly plummeted. So there's a pocket of money there, and you might take the view, well, if we're going to build transport infrastructure with it, let's make sure it's the right stuff, that it adds up, that we've got a benefit to cost that's way north of 1, and we haven't seen a business case. So you might take the view, a very sort of dinosaur view, well, why don't you leave the money kicking in a couple of billion a year to the state treasury and not start building these things that look a bit dodgy? Maybe. Some solutions, just to wrap it up before I sit down. I think an element that's missing in this is genuinely objective project assessment. Everyone who's a party to this deal has their bread buttered and the jam put on the bread by saying what's required to be said, unfortunately. Consultants want the next job, whether they say it or not. There's no great independence. And if you work in there, and I've done years ago a couple of jobs, and I know firsthand that frank advice isn't always welcome. So there's a great room, I think, to the government's own advantage to build some objective oversight into this. It would help us. I think it would help them, because at the moment I don't think they look really good. They look as if they've got a mission to build this, and I can't find the business case, I can't find the analysis to support these concerns. Maybe it's there, but I talk to other people, and I don't know anyone that's finding substantial answers. You dig through the top layer, and it's nothing, and eventually you come to this seal box called Sydney Motorway Corporation, which is protected. And look, I agree they should be protected in commercial matters, but not in technical matters. Technical matters should be open for public purview. We're paying for it. You want best practice ventilation because you want safety. And I haven't seen the evidence that that's been properly embraced. And it's important for the reason I mentioned. The only thing we've got some numbers on is North Connect, and it gets ugly. And all of these tunnels are being ventilated by the same method. There needs to be some level of independent oversight. The government should do that because it's better for them to do that. I don't get why, or I think I get why, there's a lot of money slopping around in these things. But I think the government, from a political point of view, should look at that and that terribly carefully, and the transparency. And one of the golden rules in all of this, if you're not sure, be careful. Take a precautionary approach. Now, at the outset, I come to it not being certain. I don't come to it saying, don't build this tunnel or build it. But I'm saying we haven't got enough information to know at the moment, and we deserve a bit of information. And I think I'd close by simply saying there are other options, there are other alternatives, and I think Michelle might mention some of those. I mentioned the international experience. There are other things, I'll leave it to Michelle, but we need a balanced approach. We need to deal with those issues I've mentioned, and I think it's terribly important that that's done to a far greater degree of rigour than we're seeing at the moment. Thanks.